For centuries, debt had been a sin. Deficits were moral failures. Balanced budgets were the sign of honest governance, a kind of fiscal chastity. But Keynes flipped the moral script. He told governments that spending in hard times wasn't reckless. It was responsible. He made debt sound like duty, and saving sound selfish, and in doing so, he rewired the logic of capitalism itself, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The story begins in the ashes of the Great Depression. Imagine the world in 1930. Banks collapsing, factories silent, millions jobless. The old economic playbook, the one built on Adam Smith and the invisible hand, said the market would fix itself. Supply and demand would rebalance. Prices would fall until people bought again. Recovery, in theory, was automatic, but theory doesn't feed a starving family. In the real world, demand didn't come back. Factories didn't reopen. And people, terrified of losing what little they had left, stopped spending entirely. The economy wasn't correcting. It was freezing. This was the world Keynes looked at and realized something radical. Markets aren't perfect. They don't always heal themselves. Sometimes they get stuck in a feedback loop of fear. When people stop spending, businesses stop hiring. When businesses stop hiring, incomes fall. And when incomes fall, spending collapses even more. It's a spiral, a kind of economic black hole. Keynes saw that what the economy lacked wasn't discipline or thrift. It was demand. Money flowing through the system. In simple terms, recessions happen when everyone tries to save at once, and paradoxically, that collective caution makes everyone poorer. He called it the paradox of thrift. What's wise for one household, cutting expenses, saving cash, becomes disastrous when everyone does it at the same time, because one person's spending is another person's income. When spending dies, so does the economy's heartbeat. So Keynes proposed something heretical. If private demand collapses, public demand must replace it. The government must step in, borrow money, hire workers, build projects, and put cash back into circulation. That money would create jobs. Jobs would create income. Income would create spending. And that spending would restart the machine. To the old economists, this was madness. Governments weren't supposed to interfere. Deficits were dangerous. Debt was a curse. But Keynes saw it differently. He wasn't saying debt was good. He was saying that timing mattered. He believed governments should act counter-cyclically, spend during downturns, save during booms. Stimulus and restraint, not one or the other, but both in rhythm. He used a simple metaphor. The economy, he said, is like a car. In normal times, the private sector drives, but when it stalls, the government has to turn the key, pump fuel into the engine until it catches again. Once it's running, the government steps back. That's how you keep motion alive. In his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, Keynes built this logic into a complete framework. He introduced the idea of aggregate demand, the total amount of spending in an economy from consumers, businesses, and the government. When that demand falls, so does output and employment. And the only way to restore it is to boost spending, directly or indirectly, until confidence returns. But this wasn't just math. Keynes saw economics as psychology. He said markets are driven by what he called animal spirits, the instincts, hopes, and fears that move people to invest or hide their money. You can't fix those with equations. You fix them with action, visible, confident, collective action. When governments spend, they don't just buy materials and hire workers. They send a signal. We believe in recovery. That belief itself becomes economic energy. That's what Keynes understood. That confidence, not austerity, ends recessions. Still, his ideas didn't spread overnight. In the early 1930s, the world's leaders clung to the old religion of austerity. Britain returned to the gold standard, strangling its own exports. Germany's government slashed spending to prove discipline and drove its economy into chaos, paving the way for extremism. And in the United States, Herbert Hoover, facing the worst depression in history, refused large-scale intervention, convinced the market would right itself. It didn't. By 1933, a quarter of Americans were unemployed. Bank failures were wiping out life savings. The free market had frozen into silence. And that's when Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the stage. A politician, not an economist, but one whose instincts aligned with Keynes's logic. He didn't yet call it Keynesianism, but the idea was the same. When fear stops people from spending, the government must spend for them. Roosevelt's New Deal wasn't a single program. It was an entire philosophy. Massive public works projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Hoover Dam employed millions. The Works Progress Administration hired artists, teachers, and builders. The government became the nation's largest customer, paying wages directly into the bloodstream of the economy. And slowly, it worked. Demand returned. Confidence rose. By the late 1930s, the United States was recovering, though not yet healed. It would take something far bigger and far darker to prove Keynes's ideas beyond debate. That something was war. When World War II erupted, governments across the world did exactly what Keynes had been urging. They spent without hesitation. Factories reopened, not for consumer goods, but for tanks, ships, and planes. Governments borrowed massively, not to stimulate, but to survive. And for the first time in history, unemployment vanished in the middle of a global crisis. The irony was brutal. Total war became the ultimate experiment in Keynesian economics. And it worked. Production soared, incomes rose, economies roared back to life, even as bombs fell. It wasn't prosperity, but it was proof. Large-scale government spending could end a depression. When the war ended, Keynes's theories weren't just accepted, they became gospel. His fingerprints shaped everything that followed. The Bretton Woods system, post-war reconstruction, the birth of the welfare state, the long golden age of growth from 1945 to 1973. Keynes had given capitalism a second life, one managed by governments, balanced by policy, and guided by the idea that prosperity wasn't found in austerity, but in motion. But like every great idea, it carried a hidden cost. Because once a system learns that spending can solve any crisis, it also learns that restraint can be postponed forever. After World War II, Keynes wasn't just an economist, he was a prophet. Governments across the world rebuilt from rubble using his blueprint. They had seen it with their own eyes. Debt could buy time, spending could buy stability, and full employment could buy peace. Europe was in ruins, and yet it was Keynes's logic that made the impossible seem manageable. The Marshall Plan, the welfare state, and the post-war social contracts that defined modern democracies, all of them were built on his central idea. Demand must never be allowed to die. Factories that once made bombs now produced cars, radios, refrigerators. Soldiers returned to jobs building the world they had just fought to save. And behind that boom was a silent revolution. Governments no longer waited for markets to act. They managed them. Through the 1950s and 60s, Keynesian economics became more than theory. It was the operating system of the free world. Public works, cheap credit, unemployment insurance, housing projects, infrastructure, all tools to sustain consumption and prevent collapse. Recessions were shorter, recoveries were faster. The business cycle, once treated like weather, was now something policymakers believed they could control. For the first time in history, capitalism was on a leash, and Keynes had handed the leash to the state. But this success carried an invisible side effect: dependency. The more governments used spending to smooth out downturns, the harder it became to stop. Politicians discovered that voters liked the feeling of stimulus, but not the discipline of saving. The idea that governments should run surpluses in good times, Keynes's golden rule, was conveniently forgotten. And so, by the late 1960s, something started to change. The machine that once stabilized capitalism began to overheat. Prices started rising. Wages followed. The tight balance between growth and inflation began to slip. And when the 1970s oil shocks hit, the world learned the limits of Keynesian control. Stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, wasn't supposed to happen. According to Keynesian theory, they were opposites, but oil prices shattered the logic. Economies were flooded with cash and starved of energy. The machine was out of sync. Governments tried to spend their way out of the crisis, but this time, spending only made prices worse. Confidence collapsed, and the faith in Keynes began to fade. That's when a new school of thought emerged. Monetarism, led by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. They blamed excessive government intervention for distorting the market. They argued that inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. In other words, too much money chasing too few goods. For a while, it looked like Keynes was dead, but economic theories don't die. They mutate. Even as the world turned to austerity, deregulation, and tight money in the 1980s, the core of Keynes's idea, that governments can and should intervene, never really left. It just went quiet, waiting for its next crisis. That crisis came in 2008. When global markets crashed under the weight of their own greed, the old reflex returned. The same governments that had preached fiscal restraint for decades suddenly rediscovered the power of spending. Bailouts, stimulus packages, quantitative easing, all versions of Keynes's original playbook, but on a scale he could never have imagined. Trillions were printed, interest rates were slashed to zero. Central banks didn't just guide the economy, they became the economy. And once again, it worked. At first, the system didn't collapse, confidence returned, markets soared, but the recovery exposed a new kind of imbalance, one Keynes never planned for. His theory assumed that government spending would reach workers, households, and industries, the real economy. But in the 21st century, money flows differently. Stimulus flooded financial markets instead of factory floors. It inflated asset prices, not wages. Stocks rose, housing boomed, inequality exploded. The government had learned how to restart the engine, but it was now turbocharging the wrong side of the system. Then came the pandemic, and Keynes was resurrected yet again, this time in his purest form. Governments didn't hesitate. They borrowed and spent at a speed no one thought possible. Checks went straight into bank accounts. Central banks printed trillions overnight. It was Keynes without moderation, a global experiment in fiscal adrenaline. For a moment, it felt like magic. Unemployment collapsed. Markets hit record highs. Even as the world shut down, economies seemed alive. But then, the bill arrived. Inflation roared back. Supply chains broke. And once again, governments faced the same dilemma. The cure that saved the system had weakened it. Keynes had designed a tool to stabilize capitalism. But what happens when that tool becomes the system itself? Today, almost a century after the general theory, Keynes's logic is everywhere. And that's the problem. Every time growth slows, governments reach for the same lever. Stimulus, borrow, spend, inflate, repeat. But each rescue leaves the economy a little more dependent, a little more leveraged, and a little more fragile. The state is no longer the spender of last resort. It's the spender of first resort, and often the only one left. Modern politicians have learned how to use Keynesianism without its limits. They run deficits in booms and in busts. They spend not to stabilize, but to stay in power. The balance Keynes imagined, discipline in prosperity, support in crisis, has been replaced by permanent stimulus, disguised as policy. And yet, his brilliance still stands. Keynes didn't give governments a blank check. He gave them a mirror. He showed them that economics isn't just math or money. It's psychology, belief, trust. When people lose confidence in the future, they stop spending. And when they stop spending, economies die. Keynes built a theory to keep that belief alive, even when everything else fails. But here's the haunting truth. The modern world runs on belief without boundaries. The same system that Keynes saved has turned his medicine into addiction. Every time crisis hits, we spend. And every time we spend, the threshold for pain gets lower. Today's markets don't fear recession, they fear withdrawal. Keynes once said, "In the long run, we are all dead." He meant it as a challenge, that governments shouldn't wait for the invisible hand to fix what people can't survive. But over time, it became something else, an excuse. A license to borrow endlessly, to push consequences into the future, to live permanently in the short run. And that's the irony of John Maynard Keynes. He didn't destroy capitalism. He saved it, again and again. But in saving it, he also made it mortal, dependent, fragile. The man who taught governments to spend also taught them how to forget restraint. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.